Justifying factors. Young drivers. Now, it's important to follow these three steps. Number one, you need to educate them on the concept of a young driver being a high risk. Number two, you're going to emphasize that it's not so much based on their age, it's based on statistics. DMV statistics, insurance company statistics, reports that are generated based on young drivers. And number three, you're going to create a story, you're going to relate to that situation, either using yourself or someone you know, and make it relevant to making decisions as a young teenager or a young adult. And based on the way we think when we're younger, it makes sense because we don't have the experience or the knowledge to make the best decisions in the beginning. We learn as we go. So therefore, it creates a higher possibility of making major mistakes or more mistakes than someone that's been driving for the last 10, 15 years. And you could also use whoever else is with the young driver. So for instance, if there's an older sister or their parents, you could tell them, you could use that as a comparison that the decisions that they make are completely different than the young driver. Your goal is to sell the idea that a young driver makes more mistakes simply because they don't have the experience, they don't have the knowledge, and it's more common to make mistakes in the beginning. Nothing negative, that's just the way it works. So, number one, high risk. So you're going to tell the customer that young drivers are considered a high risk, and this is mainly because insurance companies lose a lot of money. They pay more for claims, they pay more money out of pocket for policies where a young driver is where this policy offers coverage for a young driver. And the reason why, because there's a tendency now it's actually going to be connected and is going to transition from the high risk into the statistics. And you're going to tell them because based on statistics, young drivers are involved in accidents more than drivers over the age of 30 or over the age of 40. Based on reports that we obtain from the DMV, from the insurance companies, reports in general, one of the most common statistics is that young drivers are involved in accidents more than drivers that have been driving for the last 10 years, for instance. And this is going to transition you from the statistics into using a real life example and comparing an older driver and the way they think and the way they drive and having experience versus a young driver. So you're going to tell them, look, matter of fact, I've been driving for the last 10 years and I can guarantee you one thing. These statistics and the way they look at the situation, it makes sense. There's a lot of logic behind it. I actually agree 100% because when I was 16, when I was 18, I was already driving, but guess what? My priorities weren't exactly the way they are today. I was driving a little bit faster. I didn't care what my parents were telling me. I was excited, happy to be on the road. So maybe I drove a little bit more aggressive than what I should have. The decisions that I was making within that time are not as good as they are today. So by me encountering some negatives in the past, I actually learned how to make better decisions. So therefore, the decisions that I made at one point are completely different than the decisions that I'm making today. Put yourself in their situation, sir. Do you agree that you think differently than your son? Do you agree that you drive differently than your son? Do you agree that your priorities are completely different than the priorities of your son? Would you agree that the mistakes that you're making are, or if you make any mistakes, I'm not saying you're making mistakes, but if you were to make a mistake, that it would be completely different than the mistakes that he would make? For instance, maybe one of the mistakes that you would do is you forgot to pump gas before you left. Now you have to do it on your way back. Versus the mistake that he's going to do is he's going to be using his phone. That's a distraction. He's going to possibly forget to put a seatbelt. He's going to drive a little bit more than the speed limit. So those are the mistakes that he's making or that he would possibly make simply because maybe he doesn't understand exactly how it works. Versus maybe you made those mistakes at one point. now you already understand that it's not beneficial for you to make them. So therefore, we all think differently when we're a little bit younger, and we have more distractions. Maybe we're our music, our phone, simply our friends, passengers. There's a tendency of having a lot of chit-chatting and joking around and having a good time when we're driving versus focusing on the road. So you may be focused on the road while you're someone that's a little bit younger, and I don't mean necessarily your son, sir. I was just using an example, but it's based on statistics. So 90% of all the teenagers, all the young adults are going to go through this stage. So they may have more distractions versus you and I. Our distractions are no longer there because we've already went through that stage. So does that make sense? Perfect. Now, once again, your goal is to justify, your goal is to add value, your goal is to educate the client, to let them know why insurance companies consider young drivers more of a high risk. So therefore, you're going to use this to add value to the presentation, to add value to the options you're offering, and to convince them that whatever option you're giving them is the lowest one. And also to eliminate whatever options they were looking for. Maybe they were looking for $70 a month, and the lowest one that we have is $150. So you need to really educate them on the reasons why insurance companies consider young drivers a high risk. Once again, one of the most important things that I'm teaching you within all of these courses is to elaborate, to offer information, to educate, to convince, to persuade, to create a story, to justify, to add value. Once again, to add more value. So the more value you add, the better understanding they have of their situation, and the more willing they are to make a decision. Now, if their mentality was to find something for $70 a month, you're not going to convince them on the $150. That's double. But if you educate them, if you give them the right information, you give yourself an opportunity to actually convince them. So by simply telling the customer, look, sir, the rate is $140 to $150 because you have a young driver on your policy. But this is the lowest that I have. As a client, I'm going to tell you that's too much. Let me run out of here. Matter of fact, bye. And then they're gone. See, if you educate them before you give them the price, before you give them the $140 to $150, you give them all of this information, which it should take you a couple minutes. So it's not just 10 seconds and let's go. No, you need to create a story, elaborate, make it interesting, convince them, use real life examples, compare different situations. Truly what I gave you, the example that I gave you a couple seconds ago, just create a story, make it fun, make it interesting. And that's going to be enough for them to understand the situation, and it gives you a better chance of convincing them. Make sure to elaborate, educate, don't just give them the information, because when you're giving them the information, it's simply like reading a paper. They could do that. They could go online and check young drivers, and it's going to say high risk. So it's easy, as simple as that. Your job is to elaborate, to educate, and to persuade.